What is good, everyone? This is your host, Deanna Radulescu with Label Free Podcast. To live your best life, you must live label free. As always, bring you incredible guests from all over the world, so sit back, relax, and tune in. My next guest is an entrepreneur, author, and coach who sees psychedelic use as a skill cultivated through clear intention, supportive mentorship, and courageous exploration. Mastering the skill is crucial in the story of humanity's present, future evolution. He is also the founder of Third Wave. Please welcome Paul Austin. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Deanna. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. So I love this conversation. I've only had one other conversation in the show around psychedelic use. So I always like to start off like, what put you on the path to, because there's always a story, right? We all have a reason why
Always a story.
we get to where we are. And it's always like, that's like what really kind of draws us in is that story of, okay, well, tell me why. So I want to know, like, what was the beginning for you to go into this world of psychedelics?
So at the age of 16, I started smoking a little bit of cannabis, and I grew up in a pretty traditional religious family, quite sheltered. And my parents found out, and they weren't really too happy. You know, they were very anti-drugs. They were very anti-weed. They were, just sort of shocked and appalled. And my dad looked at me. It was one Sunday after church, and he looked at me and said, I can't believe that you would do this. I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident, like 35 years ago, right? So there was a deep sense of shame and guilt associated then with, starting to explore my own consciousness. And then at the age of 19, that same friend who introduced me to cannabis introduced me to psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms initially, and then LSD. And what I healed in that early psychedelic work was the sort of shame and guilt that I had been raised in, that I wasn't supposed to do certain things, or I wasn't supposed to act certain ways, or, all of the sort of ways in which culture and community and society can kind of tear us down. I was like, oh, the problem is not with me. I was just born in the wrong place for who I am. So at the age of 21, I was really inspired to travel. So I moved to Turkey, where I taught English for a year. And then soon after that, I moved to Thailand, where I started my first online business and started living, like digital nomad, remote work, travel, every month somewhere new. And around that time, I was living in Budapest, and psychedelics were starting to be talked about on like Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, more research coming out, cannabis being reevaluated. And was with a couple friends. We were like, I think we can paint a new picture of psychedelics that presents them as these tools for entrepreneurs, founders, creators, builders, innovators. And so that's really been the ethos behind Third Wave, is how do we make psychedelics more accessible? And I've done that particularly through the lens of microdosing, because microdosing is very low dose psychedelic use and has become quite popular as of late. And so that's, my whole ethos is start low and go slow.
Yeah.
Because what happened in the 60s was there was just too much LSD everywhere, and that led to a backlash. So we kind of got to slow our roll a little bit.
So we'll get into the microdosing and what that means and what that looks like for people and how that's helpful. So I've always loved personally, and I'm going to say this, everybody knows I've got no skeletons in the closet. I always loved psychedelics. Like I loved acid when I was younger. I probably wouldn't do that anymore because it's such a commitment. Like that's a long commitment, right? But I always loved mushrooms. I always had like such a great, like euphoric experience on mushrooms, just like laughing and just like, if I know some people when they look in the mirror, they felt like their face is melting, but I looked in the mirror and I thought I was so beautiful. I'm like, oh my God, I love looking like this, and just like the after. So, if you've ever like partied or even like drinking, the next day you don't feel so great, but I always felt okay after doing mushrooms. So that's why I always enjoyed it, because not only do you have like a great time and it's like a really like happy feeling. I understand that sometimes if people are in the wrong place, like in the wrong like place in their mind, they could have a negative experience. But I always had a great experience, and the next day felt good, right? Felt like I had balanced myself out, and it was just like I was a breath of fresh air. And it was like a reset kind of. And so I've always had that great experience. So I'm loving having like these conversations around microdosing and like using psychedelics more as a healing type of resource than just having a trip, right?
or even enhancement, there's a lot of clinical research on the efficacy of psychedelics for PTSD, depression, alcoholism, traumatic brain injury, cigarette addiction, right? Fantastic results. And, I'm an entrepreneur, you're an entrepreneur, a lot of my friends are not necessarily having deep clinical issues, but they're interested in microdosing for enhancement, for performance, for better communication, for social ability, right? That's how I first got into microdosing 10 years ago. I was like, I'd like to drink less alcohol and more have, like you said, take a low dose of LSD. I'd have to do it early, you're up all night.
Yeah.
But I would kind of, I would start to rely on those tools. And I think that's really been the sort of focus is the clinical and regulated environments have a lot of structure set up to ensure it's safe and effective. And what I've always been more interested in is how do we, in our communities and just broader culture outside of these regulated institutions, how do we ensure people can access this in a safe way? And with microdosing, it's 1/10 of a regular dose. It's what I would consider it sub-intoxicating or even sub-perceptual, meaning you might feel it a little bit, but you can navigate your everyday life. You're not intoxicated, and people will utilize it instead of SSRIs and ADHD medication. And for example, if there are people even listening to this who are interested in that, what I always say is do so under the guidance of a medical professional. And what's great about in today's world, there are a lot of doctors and psychiatrists and medical professionals who know about psychedelics and microdosing now. This wasn't the case 5-6 years ago, but a lot has changed. And then my interest is in flow, creativity, leadership, vision, right? So how can microdosing and low dosing of LSD and mushrooms help with that? And the thing with a microdosing protocol is it's 2 or 3 times a week for maybe a month or 2 months. It's not just you take a low dose once and see what happens. It's really a protocol that you commit to and go through over 1 to 2 months. And you do that. I typically recommend for beginners, they do the same substance. So the most common microdose substance are psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. Mushrooms, about 80% of people who microdose with mushrooms, about 20% with LSD. Mushrooms are much more accessible. We have a grow kit on Third Wave where you can grow. We make it easy for you to grow your own mushrooms. Yeah. They're much more widespread. LSD is a little more difficult to access.
Sure. Now you do it 2 to 3 times a week for a month, 2 months, just a month.
Yeah, minimum 30 days is what I say, but a lot of people go longer. They'll go 60 days, they'll go 90 days because it's working so well.
So let's say somebody is on the traditional antidepressant or something like this, and this maybe have been a recommendation from a doctor, maybe we could try this. What do you think, in your experience, right? Not everybody. This is not for everyone in his experience. What could someone expect to see after a month of maybe choosing a microdosing option instead of an antidepressant?
Well, the most common thing is just weaning off of antidepressants. So the core difference between microdoses of psychedelics and antidepressants is if you stop taking your antidepressants, you get substantial withdrawals. It's physically very difficult. Whereas with microdosing, you can microdose a couple times a week or even 3 times a week. The standard protocol with mushrooms is every other day, and you can stop and absolutely no withdrawals, right? So physically non-addictive compared to SSRIs. Also, what SSRIs tend to do is they tend to blunt and repress emotion. They sort of bring you into this state of, it's called anhedonia, which is the state of everything's just sort of fine.
Yeah.
And that can be really helpful in the short term if someone is heavily, highly depressed or suicidal, but in the long term, it creates this lack of feeling and lack of vitality. And so what people are noticing is as they're weaning off antidepressants and they start with microdosing, there's a bit more ups, but also a bit more downs. You become just more aware of your struggles and your challenges, but it also creates an opportunity, especially when done with a therapist or a coach, practitioner, to unpack that, to understand where it's coming from, and to deal with the root cause of it, which is what psychedelics help so much with, which is often trauma or even genetics, but early childhood trauma is usually the most common thing that leads to alcoholism, addiction, depression, right? These sorts of things. And psychedelics help us to sort of unpack that material. One anecdote is when I was in my late 20s, I lived in New York, never seen a therapist before, but the stress of New York was really getting to me and there was a lot going on in business. So I ended up seeing a therapist once, probably every couple weeks over 6 months. And every time I'd go in, I'd take a low dose of mushrooms, about 200 milligrams, which is at the high level of a microdose. And it was just nice because normally I had a hard time feeling my feelings.
Yeah.
But when I took a little bit of mushrooms within a therapeutic context, I was able to like feel my anger and feel my sadness. And it just created a little bit more flexibility for me to unpack and deal with these emotions.
Yeah, deal with it and then let it go, because it's almost like a reset, right? And that's why they're finding so many great purposes for this, like using psychedelics in treatment for anxiety, depression, and even like you had mentioned leadership. And I had told you a story before we started recording that I just talked to a future guest on how he used psychedelics to stop drinking. He had a real bad relationship with alcohol, so like that addiction piece is a big part too. Even though you're using a psychedelic, which is kind of essentially like a drug, but it's a different kind of drug that kind of helps like reset, I think, like the chemicals in your body, right? Isn't that what I'm trying, like, I understand?
Yeah. I mean, that's another great point. It's like our understanding of drugs is very skewed by the war on drugs, when in fact, there's a lot more nuance, especially between psychedelics and opiates, psychedelics and cocaine, psychedelics and amphetamines and methamphetamines. All of these have a much different way of interacting with the brain. Psychedelics I consider to be more like true medicine rather than just a drug that we're taking to paper over an issue. And that deeper medicine, the indigenous people who work with psychedelics like ayahuasca would say it's a medicine for the spirit or the soul.
Yeah.
And that's where our deepest healing can happen. Now, I think that's important and great, but also what I've always focused on is what are the practical aspects of behavioral change. So how can psychedelic work help us to eat better? How can they help us to have better relationships, move more often, get more sunlight, get better sleep? That's been my really interest and focus, because all of the esoteric spiritual stuff is great, but if it's not actually integrated and things don't change in our everyday reality, then it can often just be a distraction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great point, and I didn't even think about that. So, how does that influence those positive things, moving more, getting more sunshine, and in having a healthier lifestyle? So, I've never had that type of conversation around psychedelics. So, how does that help people implement a more healthier lifestyle?
So, my hypothesis, and this is from both research and anecdotes, is the hypothesis is when you have, and this is particularly true with high doses of psychedelics, like high doses of psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca. People often have what's called a mystical experience, this connection with God, source, unity, oneness, the divine, whatever you want to call it, and they experience unconditional love. Right, that's how a lot of people describe it. Is there's a deep feeling of unconditional love, and so when you feel how healing that is, like when you're in that state and you feel that unconditional love, there's a deep desire around how do I maintain this? How do I hold on to this? How do I feel this more often? Right. So this is what the Buddhists would call enlightenment. And in fact, a lot of people who did acid in the 60s became meditators, long-term meditators, because that was a more stable way to access these states. So when we come out of that, then the natural question is, well, what are ways in which I'm harming myself? What are ways in which I'm not fully loving myself? It comes back to self-love, I think, in many ways. And then usually people go, okay, I'm not going to have that toxic relationship anymore, or I'm not going to eat that toxic food anymore, or I'm going to really, move my body more because I want it to feel good. So there tends to be a relationship there between, I'm experiencing the state. And then the question is, how do I turn that into actually something that I can feel all the time?
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah. I mean, I definitely, I can relate to the self-love. I mean, if I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like, oh, I love myself, I'm so pretty, so I get that. And I think that that's a great example. What's good, everyone? This is your host, Deanna Radulescu with Label Free Podcast. So I'm very much into my vitality, my health and wellness, fitness, all those things. So I love the telehealth concierge services. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but there's an online telehealth resource to help you with your health and wellness, sexual health, weight loss, peptides, what have you. And I really enjoyed the last therapy I did with them. This time I'm doing weight loss, you guys, because I've been a little bit slowing down here at this age, and I'm looking for something to boost that metabolism. I highly recommend Valhalla Vitality. I have a discount code for you, Deanna15, and I will have the link in the description below for you to go sign up, check them out, get your appointment scheduled. You'll have a meeting with a great telehealth doctor, supervisor, consultant that will walk you through what it is that you're looking for to improve in your vitality. Again, this is Deanna Radulescu with Label Free Podcast, and I'm here to endorse Valhalla Vitality. Now, you mentioned like this is great for leadership, and I've one of my other conversations I've had around this, it really allows people like high performing people to kind of I forget what the conversation was around, but it's great for people in leadership, high performing athletes, anyone that's in like a high stress level job. And so can you explain to us like how it's good for people in those type of roles?
Yeah, so there's two things that I would attribute it to. And these are I think the core aspects of leadership. One is the ability to adapt to uncertain situations and novel situations, because especially in entrepreneurship and running a business, you can account for quite a bit. There's a lot that you can't account for. Life is way more random and uncertain than we really know and understand.
Yeah.
Unless you're an entrepreneur. If you're an entrepreneur, you get that. And so there has to be adaptability. You have to think quickly on your feet. You have to move fast. You have to learn at a high rate. And what psychedelics do is they help with neuroplasticity. So they help the brain to become more plastic. They help to produce something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. And so when you have these open windows of neuroplasticity, back to behavioral change, it's much easier to stop eating the not so great thing, or to stop smoking, or because as you've experienced, there's just more fluidity, there's more presence, there's an easier way to flow with life. So I think the first thing is neuroplasticity, helping leaders to adapt to uncertain contexts and situations and not get overwhelmed, feel like they got it, they can handle it. The second thing is courage. I think another core aspect of leadership is how do we show up? How do we make difficult decisions? How do we do the right thing, even if it's not agreeable with everyone? How do we take risks that may work and also may not work, and have the willingness to do that? And when we work with high doses of psychedelics, what's happening is the amygdala, which is a tiny almond-shaped size that's deep in the brain. It's part of our reptilian brain, the oldest part of our brain. The amygdala is sort of our fear response center, which is helpful because we don't want to just be jumping off buildings all the time. It's helpful to have a fear response center. But in modern life, that's become overwhelmed. People have way too much stimuli. They're spending a lot of time in a sympathetic state, fight or flight. And so when we work with psychedelics, it opens up that parasympathetic state, it downregulates the fear response from the amygdala, and it allows us to make choices and decisions that, although they may be difficult, we know ultimately are best for us in the long term. So, and that, of course, is important as a leader, whether it's as of a company, an organization, a church, a community, a family, right? Like great leadership all share commonalities. And for me, the two biggest things are, can you think quick on your feet and adapt? And can you make the courageous and difficult decision when it needs to be made?
Yeah, no, I love it. I am so pro this. I think that, our society is overly medicated from big pharma, and it's really, I think it's done a lot more harm than good, right? And people just, if they have one ailment, they're going to go for another prescription. I think that something like psychedelics, and I even know like a gentleman I talked to, they have a ketamine clinic in LA, and he was also talking, like they're talking about using like MDMA for pharmaceutical use as well, for in some of these instances too, where it's much better option than big pharma prescribed medication. And so I think that this is a great option for people that are willing to try something new to make a positive impact in their life, because I think it's like full circle, right? Not only if you're going to microdose for, treatment, it's going to help with your anxiety, help with your depression, help with your, your fear response, what you just talked about. And if you are in a leadership or like you're a high performing person, it's going to help regulate a lot of those stimuli that you got going on in that role. And like I said, it's like a reset. I mean, I've never microdosed. I've always just jumped off the cliff and had fun. But I'm assuming that if you're microdosing every week for 30 days, it's going to have a pretty significant impact at the end of those 30 days.
And especially on those two aspects, courage, neuroplasticity, and people just find they have a greater zest for life. And then, if they want to do high doses. A lot of people find starting at a lower dose is a great onboarding. You get a sense of it. I highly recommend combining it with yoga, meditation, breath work, right? Sauna, cold plunge. There's a lot of great other modalities that you can combine with microdosing. And then if someone's ready to do a high dose, usually what I say is we have what we call our 5 key elements, and that's assessment. So you should go through some sort of assessment. You should work with a coach or a practitioner. Preparation for the experience, the actual experience. What's the medicine? How much of the medicine? How are you doing it? Where are you doing it? Who are you choosing to do it with? And then what we call integration, which we've talked a lot about today after the high dose. How do we bring that into our everyday life, and microdosing? So those are our 5 key elements. That's what, part of the vision of this third wave of psychedelics is how do we create coaches and practitioners? How do we train doctors and therapists? So what we've also done the last 2.5 years is we've trained over 200 practitioners in how to work with psychedelics. And so if there's anyone who's listening to this who's like, what are my best next steps? Like, okay, I'm curious, I'm interested, where do I go? On third wave, we have a directory of retreat centers, clinics, therapists, and coaches. So if you want a trustworthy provider, you can go to that. You can work with a coach or a practitioner that we've trained. And we also have a lot of guides. I host my own podcast. So there's a lot of opportunities that can come out of this. And I just wanted to make Third Wave like a one-stop shop, online, like education providers. And we also have a free community that folks can join.
So it's twofold. So you have a list of providers, but you also can help certify people to provide this type of therapy for individuals. Do they have to have any specific kind of certifications themselves to get certified through you?
So this is through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, and we have some clinicians. We have a lot of coaches and practitioners. We have yoga instructors, body workers, founders and entrepreneurs who have exited and want to do more meaningful things with their lives and are looking at this as like a side gig or something they want to do full time. So it's very diverse. A license is not required, but we do have an application process, and we're somewhat selective with the group and who we curate. And it's a really important, I think, professional community, because so many people who do the work in this space feel isolated or alone, and having people you can do this with is fantastic.
How do you think someone should start out? So if someone's listening to this and it's like, you know what, I want to give this a try. I've never done microdosing or anything like that. So what would be the first step for them by listening to this? Can you walk them through that, like where they should go? Obviously your website, what they should look for, and what you think they could expect by going through this whole process with you.
So I wrote a book called Mastering Microdosing. So if folks are like, I want a much deeper dive, that's a great initial resource. I think if folks are coming out of this and interested, we offer a 45-day microdosing challenge through Third Wave, where we coach you in a group coaching format, coach you through a 45-day experience.
Okay.
We don't directly provide, but we help facilitate connections and introductions to different resources. And the way we've structured that is every other day. Most people work with psilocybin mushrooms. So of course, that's the first key, is like, how do you access the mushrooms? We have a sourcing guide on Third Wave. So it's like a 60-page free PDF that people can download that helps them to navigate the whole ecosystem. But it's like, get the substance, figure out your dose level. That's what I call calibration. So experiment with a few different dose levels to see what's appropriate for you and what works for you. Commit to doing it, like I said, every other day for at least 30 days. So 1 month, and then have some sort of a practice of, maybe journaling or meditation, some aspect of self-reflection, so you can get a sense of, oh, I'm noticing these changes. Because the other thing that we haven't talked a lot about is intention is a big thing that's talked about when working with psychedelics. Especially with high doses, what's your intention? A lot of people, it's surrender, it's heal, it's love. With microdosing, it's also helpful to have an intention. And usually what I encourage folks is have that intention be something very specific. Like, I want to write a book, or I want to write a chapter of a book, or I want to meditate for 20 minutes every day, or I'd like to commit to doing breath work every day. Root that microdosing protocol in some sort of physical practice that will support you even when you stop microdosing. Because usually what we tell folks is microdose, 2-3 times a week for a month or 2 months or 3 months. Take a break within the first few months. Take 2 to 3 weeks off. Evaluate where you're at. Assess how it's gone. And then if you want to continue from there, you can do another microdosing protocol after that.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that because I like the intention part. What, and maybe, I don't think we touched on this. So if someone's going to start this and they got to figure out their dosage, like, you said, experiment with that. Can you give an example of what, if they've never tried mushrooms before and anything, any type of psychedelics, what should they be expecting or go like to feel in that microdosing? Because it's not necessarily they're going to get totally high and jump off the cliff like you're going to be committed to, like you do a full one and like, woo! But just a little bit to have like, so I don't know. So even for myself, my own knowledge, if I want to start microdosing, what is it that I should look to feel in like my dosage to figure that out?
For sure. The dose level to hit is a dose that you feel, you notice it. That's what I tell people is your ceiling, right? So if your ceiling is, let's say you try 100 milligrams of psilocybin and it's like, you don't notice any changes. You try 200, you maybe notice some slight things. Then you try 300 milligrams, you're like, I definitely noticed this, right? Like I took mushrooms, my sense of taste is slightly enhanced, my sense of smell is slightly enhanced, colors are more vibrant, I'm a little bit more emotional, I'm also a little bit more present, I'm not as distracted, right? So you'll have some observations of enhancement is what I would call them. And then it's kind of up to you. 200, you felt a tiny bit. 300, you definitely noticed it. Your microdose might be somewhere between 200 and 300. Okay. And you can just sort of like play in that space and see what feels good for you. So usually that's what I tell people is start low, go slow, start at 100, then try 200, then try 300, and just find a dose level that works for you. And, caveat being people who, for example, have a history of SSRI use, they may need a little bit more than other folks. So some people who have been on SSRIs for 10 or 20 years, they might need to start with 250 and then go 500 and then go 750 or something like that. But if you don't have any prior SSRI use and you are a little bit more, generally sensitive, then starting at the 100 milligram mark is super helpful.
This has been awesome. Where can people find you, connect with you, learn more about those resources?
So Third Wave is thethirdwave.co. The Psychedelic Coaching Institute, which is our training program, is psychedeliccoaching.institute. You can just put into Google, Psychedelic Coaching Institute. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter at PaulAustin3W. I'm pretty active on social, so feel free to reach out to me there. I do some one-on-one coaching and facilitation with people as well. I have space for a few clients. So that's at paulaustin.co. So if someone's listening to this and wants, really great guidance and perspective on how to work with psychedelics, I also do a little one-on-one work.
Excellent. You guys, I'm going to put those links in the notes, so do not hesitate to reach out to him. What would you like to leave with us today?
Words of wisdom would be to ease, if you're interested in psychedelics, to ease your way in. Patience is a virtue, as my dad would always say. So better to take it slow, better to do your research, kind of orient in the space, choose a great provider to work with. There's no rush. So that would be my perspective is, explore, be curious, and also take your time as you navigate a new landscape.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul, for number one, for the work that you do. I think we're heading in a right direction with using psychedelics for people in different, anxiety, depression, leaders. I mean, I just think it's great. So I'm very excited. I might have to find someone near me and start microdosing a little bit just to see how that goes for me, because it doesn't help. It doesn't hurt to open more up for myself, right?
Exactly. Yeah, too fun.
All right. Well, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is fun.
This is your host, Deanna Radulescu with Label Free Podcast. To live your best life, you must live label free. As always, don't forget to subscribe, follow, rate, review, comment, share, all those good things. And I'll be back soon with more dynamic guests.